For decades, the Cleveland Browns have lived in quarterback chaos. Names, faces, promises, all of them flashing by so fast that fans barely had time to believe before it all fell apart again. And just when it seemed like Cleveland would once again take the slow, cautious route at the most dangerous position in sports, something happened behind closed doors that nobody expected this early. Not after a full season, not after years of evaluation, but after 7 games. According to reports stirring up serious buzz inside league circles, the Browns didn't hesitate. There was no "let's wait and see," no safety net quietly tucked behind the scenes. The organization made a decision that usually takes franchises multiple seasons and did it before most of the league even realized a choice was on the table. One move, one direction, no looking back. What's making people uncomfortable isn't just who the Browns are reportedly committing to, it's how fast it happened. This isn't how the NFL works. Quarterbacks are supposed to be projects. Careers are supposed to be measured in patience and caution. But Cleveland appears ready to gamble its future on a belief that formed almost instantly. And that belief centers around a young quarterback whose name already carries pressure, expectations, and non-stop attention. Fans are split. Some feel hope they haven't felt in years. Others feel that familiar knot in their stomach, the one that shows up right before everything collapses. Because history has taught Cleveland supporters one brutal lesson. When something feels too confident, too certain, too fast, it usually comes at a cost. And that's the question hanging over this entire situation. What did the Browns see so quickly that made them abandon caution entirely? Because whatever it was, it changed everything. And it may end up defining this franchise for the next decade. In the modern NFL, teams don't rush quarterback decisions like this. They protect themselves with competition, with timelines, with carefully worded statements about growth and development. Even when a rookie shows promise, front offices usually drag the process out, afraid of committing too early and being burned later. That's why what the Cleveland Browns are reportedly doing feels so jarring. It goes directly against the unwritten rules of how franchises handle the most important position in sports. Quarterbacks aren't crowned after a handful of starts. They're tested, doubted, challenged, and sometimes even set up to fail before being trusted. Yet Cleveland appears ready to skip all of that. The word coming out of the organization isn't competition nor evaluation, it's certainty. No quarterback carousel, no veteran fallback quietly waiting in the wings. Just a clear, firm decision that this is the direction forward. That kind of confidence is rare, and it's especially shocking coming from a franchise that knows better than anyone how dangerous early optimism can be. The Browns have been burned by fast decisions before. They've watched promising arms crumble. They've invested in talent, only to reset everything a year or two later. History alone should have forced hesitation, and yet hesitation never came. What makes this even more unusual is who signed off on it. This wasn't a coach speaking emotionally after a big performance. This wasn't a locker room-driven movement fueled by vibes and momentum. This decision traces back to the front office, guided by a general manager known for patience and restraint. When someone like Andrew Berry stops gathering data and starts drawing conclusions, it signals that something far beyond a hot streak is in play. Around the league, executives are quietly raising eyebrows, not because the Browns believe in their quarterback. Belief happens all the time, but because belief usually comes with backup plans. Cleveland, according to those familiar with the situation, isn't leaving itself an escape hatch, and that's what breaks the rulebook. This isn't a best option for now move. It's a long-term declaration made earlier than almost anyone thought possible. And once you realize that, the next question becomes impossible to ignore. What happened on the field that convinced them so fast? 7 games doesn't sound like much in the NFL. In most cases, it's barely enough time to scratch the surface, let alone reshape how an entire organization feels about its future. Inside the Cleveland Browns facility, those 7 games carried far more weight than anyone on the outside realized. While fans were still debating upside and potential, something very different was happening behind closed doors. From the moment the young quarterback stepped into the lineup, the building changed. Coaches weren't just reviewing stat sheets, they were studying habits, how he handled mistakes, how he responded to pressure, how quickly he corrected issues from one week to the next. And what stood out wasn't perfection, it was progress. Every game, something tightened up. A quicker decision here, cleaner footwork there, fewer unnecessary risks. That kind of week-to-week growth is rare, especially under the microscope of NFL defenses. What really caught attention wasn't a single highlight throw or a flashy moment replayed on social media. It was consistency. The Browns staff began noticing how often the offense stayed on schedule, how mistakes didn't snowball, how drives didn't collapse after one bad snap. That's the difference between talent and trust. Plenty of quarterbacks can make impressive throws. Very few make everyone around them calmer. There were moments early on when things didn't go smoothly. A missed read, a stalled drive, a defense adjusting mid-game. Those situations usually expose young quarterbacks, but instead of unraveling, he adjusted. The corrections showed up not weeks later, but almost immediately. That responsiveness is something teams obsess over because it tells them how fast a player can truly develop. Inside the building, belief didn't explode overnight. It quietly formed. Film sessions became less about what went wrong and more about how far this has come. Practice reps carried more urgency, more focus, more ownership. Players began responding to him as the guy, not a guy getting a chance. That kind of shift doesn't show up on a box score, but front offices notice it immediately. And as those 7 games piled up, one realization became impossible to ignore. This wasn't about surviving the season. This was about identifying something foundational. Because what he showed them wasn't just ability, it was control. There's one quality NFL coaches chase more than arm strength, more than speed, more than raw athleticism. And no matter how advanced the system or how long the coaching timeline, it cannot be taught. You either have it or you don't. Inside the Cleveland Browns organization, this is the trait that reportedly tipped everything over the edge. When the pocket starts collapsing and defenders are closing in, most young quarterbacks panic. Their eyes drop, their mechanics fall apart, they rush throws or freeze entirely. That's usually the point where development stalls. But what showed up repeatedly in those 7 games was something very different. Calm. Not the loud, confident kind, the quiet, unsettling kind that makes coaches lean forward during film study. The accuracy stood out first, not just completion percentage, but placement. Balls arriving where only the receiver could get them. Throws hitting targets in stride instead of forcing adjustments that lead to missed opportunities. Coaches often say accuracy is what separates starters from stars, and what Cleveland reportedly saw was accuracy under stress, the hardest version of it to find. But it wasn't just where the ball went, it was when it went there. Reads were made on time. Windows were trusted instead of second-guessed. Even when the first option disappeared, there was no panic. The eyes stayed downfield. The feet stayed active. The decision came without hesitation. That kind of internal clock usually takes years to develop, and yet it was showing up far earlier than expected. What made this so compelling for evaluators was that none of it looked forced. There was no over-reliance on improvised hero ball, no unnecessary risks just to prove confidence. Instead, there was discipline, the kind that suggests understanding rather than instinct alone. That's what coaches mean when they talk about a quarterback seeing the field. And once that realization settles in, everything else changes. Because if a quarterback already has that unteachable calm, then every rep matters more. Every improvement compounds faster. Development accelerates. That's when belief turns into planning. And Cleveland didn't just believe anymore. They started acting like they'd found something rare. General managers aren't supposed to get this close. In most organizations, they watch from a distance. Spreadsheets, cap projections, long-term strategy. The day-to-day development of players is left to coaches. That's why what happened next inside the Cleveland building immediately caught attention from people around the league. According to reports circulating among team insiders, Andrew Berry didn't just approve the direction from afar, He stepped into it personally. That alone signaled how serious this was. Barry is known as one of the most disciplined, analytics-driven executives in football. He doesn't move on emotion, he doesn't rush, and he almost never crosses the invisible line between front office oversight and locker room leadership. But this time, he did. Multiple accounts suggest Barry made a point to speak directly with the quarterback, face to face, not as a formality, but as a message. This wasn't about encouragement after a good performance. It was about clarity, about expectation, about trust. When a general manager delivers that kind of conversation personally, it carries a different kind of weight. It tells a player the organization isn't just evaluating anymore, it's committing. Inside the building, that moment mattered. Coaches noticed it. Players noticed it. Word travels fast in NFL locker rooms, and when the person ultimately responsible for roster decisions steps in, people understand what it means. This wasn't a motivational speech. It was alignment. Front office, coaching staff, and player moving in the same direction. For Barry, this kind of involvement isn't impulsive, it's deliberate. He's built his reputation on process, and breaking routine only happens when the process points to something undeniable. That's what made this so telling. He wasn't hedging, he wasn't softening expectations, he was reinforcing them. And once that line was crossed, the message was impossible to misread. This wasn't about seeing what might happen. The Browns had already decided. And then the commitment went even higher up the chain. When owners get involved, everything feels heavier. Decisions move from football logic into franchise-defining territory. And that's exactly why what followed raised so many eyebrows around the league.
There we go.
Inside the Cleveland Browns, this situation didn't stay confined to coaches and executives for long. It reached the very top.
Great players that we liked at the top.
Reports began circulating that Jimmy Haslam was no longer just monitoring the quarterback situation from afar. He was actively engaged. And for a franchise with Cleveland's history, that fact alone carries serious weight. Haslam has lived through every version of quarterback disappointment imaginable. He's watched early optimism collapse. He's funded resets that cost years. He knows better than anyone how destructive a wrong decision at this position can be. That's why his involvement stood out. Owners don't usually inject themselves into player development conversations unless the stakes are enormous. In this case, the buzz wasn't about impatience, it was about alignment. The front office believed, the coaching staff believed, and ownership wanted to understand exactly why this moment felt different from all the false starts that came before it. What made the situation even more intriguing was who those conversations reportedly included. According to league chatter, Haslam had open lines of communication with the quarterback's family, specifically his father, Deion Sanders. That alone sent social media into speculation mode, not because anything improper was suggested, but because Deion's presence changes the gravity of any discussion. He's not just a parent, he's someone who understands elite preparation, pressure, and legacy on a level few ever reach. It's been said that those conversations weren't about dictating outcomes, but about vision, about expectations, about ensuring that development would be handled the right way, without shortcuts or panic. For Haslam, that matters. He's been here before. This time, he appears determined not to repeat history. And once ownership leans in like that, the signal becomes clear. This isn't a trial run. This isn't a temporary solution. Cleveland isn't just hoping anymore. They're positioning themselves around a belief that if it's right, could finally change everything. But that belief came with a new wave of debate, because not everyone sees this involvement as reassuring. The moment Deion Sanders becomes part of any NFL conversation, the volume turns up instantly. His name alone invites strong opinions, bold assumptions, and endless speculation. And in this situation, the buzz surrounding his influence is only intensified as Cleveland's commitment becomes clearer. To be clear, there's been no confirmation of direct involvement in decision-making, but there's been plenty of online chatter suggesting that Deion's presence looms large over everything connected to his son's career. It's been said that few players in the league arrive with a built-in understanding of pressure quite like this, because very few were raised by someone who lived at the absolute top of professional sports. That background, supporters argue, changes how a quarterback handles expectation. Some believe that preparation is the real difference here. Deion has spoken openly in the past about grooming his son for moments like this, about mental toughness, accountability, and embracing criticism instead of running from it. While none of that guarantees success, it does add context to why Cleveland may feel unusually confident in how this quarterback handles adversity behind the scenes. Of course, not everyone sees it that way. Skeptics have raised questions about outside influence, about whether attention and headlines could become distractions instead of advantages. There's always concern when a player enters the league carrying a famous last name, not because of entitlement, but because the microscope is bigger, the expectations heavier, and the patience thinner. Every mistake feels louder. Every success gets doubted. What complicates things is that both sides of the argument can be true at the same time. It's been reported that Deion understands better than most when to step back. At the same time, it's impossible to ignore that having someone in your corner who's navigated superstardom before can be an asset if handled correctly. That balance is where the speculation lives. And that's why this factor keeps surfacing. It's not about control or interference, it's about mindset, about whether this quarterback is uniquely prepared for what usually overwhelms young players. Cleveland appears to believe that he is. But belief doesn't erase risk, and that's where the conversation inevitably turns next, to the concern that everyone is thinking, but few want to say out loud. No matter how confident the messaging sounds, one uncomfortable truth hangs over this entire situation. 7 games is still 7 games. Around the league, executives and analysts are asking the same question in quieter tones. What if this is too early? What if the league adjusts? What if the book isn't closed, but barely opened? This is the risk nobody in Cleveland wants dominating the conversation, but it's impossible to ignore. Defensive coordinators survive by finding tendencies and exploiting them. That's not personal, it's the NFL. Young quarterbacks often look composed early, before opponents have enough film to dissect every habit, every preference, every flaw. When that moment comes, it usually separates short-term excitement from long-term answers. There's also the physical toll. NFL pass rushers don't forgive indecision, and the grind of a full season has exposed many quarterbacks who looked promising in limited action. The concern isn't talent, it's durability, adaptability, and how a player responds once mistakes stack up instead of resetting week to week. That's where careers stall. Cleveland knows this. Internally, they've already run through those scenarios. It's been said the evaluation didn't stop with game day production. They studied how corrections were made, how information was absorbed, how pressure was handled after mistakes rather than highlights. That's the difference between reacting and learning, and it's the line they believe has already been crossed. But belief doesn't cancel uncertainty. It just acknowledges that every franchise quarterback decision comes with risk. The difference here is that Cleveland appears willing to accept that risk sooner than most, because waiting carries its own cost. Hesitation has derailed development before. Uncertainty has fractured locker rooms, and indecision has haunted this franchise for decades. So the Browns aren't pretending the gamble doesn't exist. They're betting that the risk of moving too fast is smaller than the risk of failing to commit at all. And that bet is already reshaping how people inside the building respond. Because once hesitation disappears, belief spreads fast. Inside NFL locker rooms, belief can't be faked. Players can sense when a situation is temporary, when a quarterback is just keeping the seat warm. And they can also tell when the organization has quietly chosen its leader. Inside the Cleveland Browns locker room, the shift has been subtle, but undeniable. Teammates have started responding differently. Communication tightens, body language changes. There's less uncertainty in the huddle, less second-guessing at the line of scrimmage. It's not about speeches or bravado. It's about trust.
Am I supposed to follow
When
the mic?
players feel like the guy taking the snap is their quarterback, not just the quarterback, everything around him sharpens. What stood out most is how quickly that trust formed. Veterans who have seen promise come and go aren't easily convinced anymore. They've lived through resets. They've adjusted to new systems and new voices too many times to get carried away. And yet, the reports coming out of the building suggest those players bought in faster than expected, not because of hype, but because of preparation. There's been quiet respect for how work is approached. Extra film sessions, conversations about coverage recognition,
we've
attention to details that don't show up on television.
There we go.
Players notice when a quarterback is invested beyond Sundays. That's usually when accountability follows. That's when a locker room starts moving in the same direction instead of splintering under pressure.
Everything ain't fast.
Leadership doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it shows up in how mistakes are owned, how credit is shared, and how composure holds when things break down. Those traits resonate inside a locker room more than any stat line ever could. It's why belief spreads faster among players than fans. And once that belief takes root, it reinforces every decision made above them. Front office confidence stops feeling theoretical. Coaching plans carry more weight. The noise from outside fades. That's why this moment feels different in Cleveland. Not because of what's being promised, but because of how the room itself is responding. This is the moment Cleveland has chased for years without ever being able to hold on to it. Clarity. Not certainty, not guarantees, but direction. The Cleveland Browns aren't pretending they've cracked some unbreakable code. They're making a choice. And in a league built on hesitation, that alone separates this gamble from the mistakes that came before it. What makes this decision so heavy isn't the confidence behind it, it's the timeline. 7 games accelerated a process that usually drags on for seasons. That speed can either become the reason this works, or the reason it doesn't. There's no safety net hidden behind the curtain, no quiet reset waiting in the background. Cleveland has aligned its leadership, its coaching, its locker room, and its future around one belief. If it pays off, this won't just be remembered as a smart evaluation. It will be viewed as the moment the franchise finally learned from its past instead of running from it. The moment patience turned into conviction. The moment Cleveland stopped searching and started building.
And if it doesn't work, then this becomes another chapter in a story Browns fans know far too well. A reminder that hope is always expensive, especially in this city. That's the risk. That's the weight of the decision. But the Browns didn't make this move out of desperation. They made it because something they saw convinced them this time was different, that the progress was real, that the mindset was rare, that waiting would only slow what was already forming. Now, the rest of the league waits, because in a sport where quarterback decisions define eras, Cleveland just chose one, and the next decade will reveal whether this was the breakthrough they've been chasing or the boldest gamble they ever made.